In the quiet forests of Oregon, where the pines grow thick and tall and shadows stretch long across the valley floor, there exists a place where the ordinary and extraordinary blur together like morning mist rising from a creek. This is Gravity Falls, a small town nestled between mountains that seem to watch over it with patient ancient eyes, where the air itself seems to hum with something older than memory, something that whispers of mysteries buried deep in the earth and secrets hidden in plain sight. To understand this place, to really know what makes it unlike anywhere else in the world, you must journey back through time, past the summer when two children first discovered its wonders, past the decades of secrets and lies that built up like layers of sediment, back to the very beginning, when the land itself was young and strange, and the first consciousness began to notice that something here was different from everywhere else. The story of Gravity Falls begins long before there were people to tell stories, in an age when the land was still being shaped by forces both natural and otherwise. The valley sits in a peculiar place geographically, a natural bowl carved out by ancient glaciers during the last ice age, when sheets of ice miles thick moved across the continent like slow, inevitable rivers of frozen time. As these glaciers retreated, they left behind a landscape that was already unusual, with rock formations that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement, caves that led down into the earth at angles that made no geological sense, and a particular configuration of minerals and magnetic anomalies that would, much later, attract the attention of scientists and seekers of the strange alike. The valley was a convergence point, a place where invisible lines of force met and crossed and created something that had not existed anywhere else. A thin spot in the fabric of reality where the impossible became merely improbable, and the improbable became almost commonplace. Long before any human footstep marked the soil of Gravity Falls, the land knew its own slow rhythms. Animals that wandered into the valley often behaved strangely, gathering in circles for no apparent reason, following paths that seemed to have meaning only to them, and occasionally giving birth to offspring that were not quite like their parents in subtle ways that other animals could sense even if they could not understand. The trees grew taller here than anywhere else in the region, their branches reaching toward a sky that seemed somehow closer, and their roots delving deeper into soil that was rich with minerals that should not have existed together in such concentrations. In certain clearings, if you had been there to see it, you would have noticed that grass grew in perfect spirals, that flowers bloomed in colors that existed nowhere else in nature, and that sometimes on very clear nights, the stars overhead seemed to move in patterns that did not match any known constellation or any known laws of astronomy. Based on what we understand about the valley's nature and the patterns of settlement around it, it seems likely that indigenous peoples who made their way to this area would have recognized something different about it. While we have no direct records from this time, the persistent local legends and the unusual absence of major settlements in the valley itself could suggest that these early inhabitants treated this as a place that demanded careful respect. They would come here for vision quests, for ceremonies that required a thin place between worlds, for gatherings when the seasons turned and the old stories needed to be retold in a place where the earth itself seemed to listen. They carved symbols into certain trees and stones, not as decorations, but as warnings and guides for those who would come after. Markers that said, "Here the rules are different. Here you must walk carefully. Here you must remember that you are a guest in a place that does not fully belong to the waking world." The oral traditions of these early inhabitants spoke of many things that later peoples would dismiss as myth or metaphor. They spoke of spirits that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, beings that were neither quite animal nor quite human, but something else entirely. Something that had always been here and would always be here long after humans were gone. They told stories of places where time moved differently, where a person could walk into the forest in the morning and emerge at sunset, having experienced only minutes, or where someone might sit for what felt like an hour and return to their village to find that days had passed. They warned of trees that would whisper secrets in languages no living person spoke, of streams that flowed uphill when the moon was full, of caves where the echo of your voice would answer in words you had not said, but perhaps had thought. These were not fairy tales told to entertain children, but serious knowledge passed down through generations. Information that was meant to keep people safe in a place where the ordinary rules of the world could not always be trusted to apply. The warnings extended to specific locations within the valley as well. There were certain clearings that should not be entered at twilight, certain paths that should not be followed on nights when the aurora could be seen even this far south, certain stones that should not be disturbed no matter how curious you might be about what lay beneath them. The indigenous peoples developed rituals and practices for safely interacting with the valley's strangeness. They knew which herbs grew here that had properties found nowhere else, plants that could heal wounds that should have been fatal or induce visions that were not hallucinations, but glimpses of other places and other times. They knew when it was safe to gather these herbs and when doing so would be dangerous, when the spirits that guarded such things were welcoming and when they were not. They understood that the land itself was alive in a way that went beyond the normal aliveness of soil and stone and growing things, that it had something like consciousness or will or purpose that was utterly alien to human understanding, but that could be respected even if it could not be fully comprehended. As centuries passed and change moved across the continent, the valley remained relatively undisturbed by major settlements. When European explorers and fur trappers began pushing into these territories, some eventually found their way to the valley. Based on the scattered records that survive, these newcomers sometimes returned with unusual catches and stranger stories, though separating fact from frontier exaggeration in these accounts remains difficult. The historical records from this period are sparse, but what accounts exist tell of trappers who claim to have encountered unusual animals in the valley, creatures that seem to be variations on familiar species, but with odd characteristics. Whether these reports reflected genuine anomalies or the embellishments common to frontier tales is difficult to determine. What is clear from the records is that some trappers who ventured into certain parts of the valley did disappear. Their camps sometimes found abandoned with their belongings intact, but no sign of the men themselves. The reasons for these disappearances could range from natural wilderness dangers to simple misfortune, though the clustering of such incidents around this particular valley is noteworthy. The indigenous peoples watched this influx of outsiders with a mixture of concern and resignation. They tried to warn the newcomers about the dangers of the valley, tried to explain that this was not a place that would tolerate being treated as mere territory to be conquered and exploited. Some of the trappers listened and learned to show the proper respect, forming relationships with the local peoples and learning at least the basics of how to move safely through the valley. Others dismissed the warnings as superstition or attempts to keep good trapping territory for themselves, and these men often did not fare well. The valley itself seemed to have a way of dealing with those who treated it with contempt or carelessness, though whether this was merely the natural dangers of wilderness combined with human recklessness or something more deliberate was a question that no one could answer definitively. The geological features of the valley have long attracted attention from those who study such things. In caves throughout the area, crystal formations display unusual structures that would later puzzle mineralogists. Reports from early visitors describe mushroom rings appearing in precise geometric patterns and wildflowers blooming in colors that seem slightly off from their typical varieties. The ancient trees in the deepest parts of the forest grow to remarkable heights, and local woodworkers, who have worked with timber from these areas, have noted its unusual durability and strength, though whether this represents something truly anomalous or simply high-quality old-growth timber remains a matter of interpretation. The trees themselves were remarkable beyond their unusual height. The oldest growth in the valley, trees that had been standing for hundreds or even thousands of years, developed peculiar characteristics as they aged. Their bark would sometimes show patterns that looked almost like writing, though in no alphabet any linguist could identify. The wood from these ancient trees, when it fell naturally or was taken with proper respect and ceremony, had properties that carpenters and woodworkers found both delightful and unsettling. It was stronger than it should be given the species, more resistant to rot and insects, and it seemed to have a kind of memory, grain patterns flowing in ways that suggested the tree had somehow recorded the events it had witnessed over its long life. Some claimed that furniture made from this wood would occasionally creak or shift in ways that corresponded to significant events, as if the wood retained some connection to the place it had grown and could sense disturbances in that place, even after being cut and shaped and moved far away. The waterfalls that would eventually give the valley part of its name have their own peculiarities. Visitors to the area have long reported that the water seems to fall with unusual force, creating deeper pools than the height and volume would typically produce. Some have theorized about localized variations in gravitational force, though measurements taken over the years have not provided conclusive evidence for this explanation. The spray from these waterfalls creates rainbows with unusual frequency, even on days with limited sunlight, and some who have spent time near these falls report feeling unusually energized afterward, though this could simply reflect the invigorating effects of spending time in nature near moving water. By the early 1800s, as the United States of America established itself and began its steady expansion westward with a fervor that mixed genuine pioneering spirit with darker impulses of conquest and displacement, the valley that would become Gravity Falls found itself in the path of this expansion. Official survey teams began mapping the region, recording details of terrain and resources with an eye toward eventual settlement and development. The indigenous peoples who had maintained their relationship with the valley for uncounted generations found themselves pushed aside by newcomers who saw the land as empty territory waiting to be claimed, despite the obvious presence of those who had been here all along. It was during this period of American expansion and indigenous displacement that the valley's recorded history truly begins, though as with so many official histories, the recorded version would prove to be significantly less than the whole truth. The man who would go down in local history as the founder of Gravity Falls was, according to all official records and monuments and Pioneer Day celebrations, a dignified gentleman named Nathaniel Northwest. The Northwest family story, as it would be told and retold until it became indistinguishable from fact in most people's minds, spoke of Nathaniel as a wealthy Easterner with vision and determination, who made the difficult journey west, discovered the valley with its abundant resources and natural beauty, and established the first permanent settlement that would grow into the town. He was portrayed as a pioneer in the truest sense, someone who brought civilization to wilderness, who saw potential where others saw only forest and stone, who combined business acumen with genuine civic spirit to create something lasting. Paintings would be commissioned showing Nathaniel Northwest in dignified frontier attire, standing atop a promontory overlooking the valley with the sun rising behind him in glorious symbolism. Statues would be erected, celebrations would be held in his honor, and the Northwest family would use this founding myth to justify their position at the very top of the town's social and economic hierarchy for generations to come. But as with so many origin stories, the official version was less truth than convenient fiction. The actual founder of Gravity Falls was a person so peculiar, so wonderfully absurd, so absolutely impossible to take seriously that later generations would find it easier to simply erase him from the record entirely, rather than try to explain how such a person could have existed at all. His name was Quentin Trembley, and among his many unusual claims to fame was his insistence, backed by what appeared to be genuine official documentation, that he had served as the 8th President of the United States. How exactly one becomes the 8th President, rather than simply the 9th President, was never entirely clear, but Trembley had elaborate explanations involving complex constitutional technicalities and the fact that he had been elected by a margin that was exactly half of what was required, so he could only be half a president, which made perfect sense to him, if to no one else. Quentin Trembley's presidency, such as it was, had been marked by decisions that ranged from the eccentric to the outright bizarre. He declared war on pancakes, which he believed were conspiring against the American people through some mechanism he could never quite articulate, but remained convinced was real and dangerous. He appointed several inanimate objects to his cabinet, including a beloved armchair that he felt gave excellent advice if you knew how to listen properly, and a lucky horseshoe that served as Secretary of Transportation because it understood the importance of good fortune in travel. He insisted that the national mammal should be something called a whimsy beast, a creature that seemed to exist only in his own imagination, but which he described in such loving detail that people almost believed it must be real somewhere. His time in office was brief, ended by a combination of impeachment proceedings, general confusion about whether he had ever legitimately held the office in the first place, and Trembley's own sudden decision that Washington had become too serious and he needed to go west, where the air was fresher and people still understood whimsy. Upon reaching the valley that would become Gravity Falls, Trembley immediately recognized it as special, though his reasons for thinking so were characteristically unconventional. He believed the strange magnetic anomalies that made compasses spin wildly would serve as a natural defense against British mind-reading attempts, which he remained convinced were an ongoing threat despite the War of 1812 having ended years earlier. He was fascinated by the unusual wildlife, declaring that animals with extra tails and unusual colorations proved this valley was actually the biblical Garden of Eden, just located considerably further west than traditional interpretations suggested. The native peoples he encountered, rather than viewing him with the suspicion or hostility they showed to most settlers, seemed to find him somehow delightful. Perhaps recognizing that someone this innocently strange posed no real threat, and might even be a useful fool to have around as a buffer against more dangerous settlers who would inevitably follow. Trembley established his settlement with the help of a small group of followers who had accompanied him from the east, people who were themselves eccentric enough to find his particular brand of chaos charming rather than concerning. They built simple structures scattered throughout the valley with no particular plan or organization, just buildings appearing wherever seemed nice at the moment. Trembley's laws for his new community were whimsical and often contradictory in delightful ways. He declared that every day was Independence Day because freedom should be celebrated always, not just once a year. He made it illegal to wear ties because they were fabric nooses, and he would not have his citizens strangling themselves slowly in the name of fashion. He insisted that all babies born in the settlement were automatically deputy sheriffs. giving them tiny badges that served no purpose, but which he felt would instill civic responsibility from the earliest possible age. He held state dinners for the local squirrels, setting out elaborate place settings and giving speeches about interspecies cooperation, while the squirrels ate the nuts he provided and probably had no idea they were attending a diplomatic function. Despite this administrative chaos, or perhaps because of it, the settlement survived and even grew slightly. The land provided abundant resources, the forests were rich with game, and the peculiar energy of the valley seemed to agree with its equally peculiar founder. People who lived under Trembley's governance reported feeling more creative, more energized, more willing to see wonder in everyday things. Children growing up in the settlement developed a particular resilience and adaptability, learning from Trembley's example that the world did not have to be as serious and rigid as other adults seemed to insist. For several years, this strange little community thrived in its own chaotic way, a place where whimsy was valued as highly as hard work, and where laughter was considered as important as any law. But history has a way of asserting itself, often through people with more conventional ambitions and less patience for chaos. Nathaniel Northwest was everything that Quentin Trembley was not. Where Trembley was whimsical, Northwest was calculating. Where Trembley valued laughter and wonder, Northwest valued wealth and status. Where Trembley saw the valley as a magical place to be enjoyed, Northwest saw resources to be extracted and controlled. Northwest arrived in the region with his family and considerable financial backing, drawn by reports of the valley's timber and mineral potential. He had grand plans for development, for establishing a proper town with proper industry and proper social structures, all of which would enrich him considerably while also allowing him to play the role of civic founder and benefactor that appealed to his sense of how important people should behave. When Northwest discovered Trembley's ramshackle settlement occupying prime real estate near the best timber stands and closest to the resources he wanted to exploit, he immediately set about finding a way to remove this obstacle. Trembley was too ridiculous to fight directly. The man would probably just laugh and offer Northwest a position as Secretary of Seriousness or something equally absurd. But Northwest had other weapons at his disposal. He had money for bribes, connections to territorial government officials who could be persuaded to declare previous land claims invalid, and most importantly, he had the willingness to simply rewrite history to suit his purposes. Through a combination of altered documents, paid witnesses, and the simple fact that Trembley's own claims were so outlandish that no one official wanted to deal with them, Northwest began systematically erasing the true founder from the record. The process took time and required careful management. Documents had to be backdated, showing Northwest arriving in the valley years before he actually had. Witnesses needed to be found who would swear they remembered Northwest being the first settler, or at least they needed to be unable to remember anyone else clearly enough to contradict the new official story. Trembley himself needed to be convinced to leave, which Northwest accomplished through a mixture of gentle persuasion and taking advantage of Trembley's own peculiar worldview. Northwest suggested that perhaps Trembley's presidential duties required him to move on, to spread his wisdom to other communities that desperately needed his guidance. He appealed to Trembley's sense of civic responsibility, arguing that it would be selfish to keep all his brilliance in one place when America had so many other locations that could benefit from his presence. In what remains one of the strangest episodes in this already strange story, Trembley agreed to be encased in peanut brittle before leaving the valley. He had become convinced, through some logic that made sense only to him, that being preserved in peanut brittle would allow him to be revived at some future date when America truly needed him again. He commissioned a hidden chamber to be built beneath what would become the town cemetery, had himself encased in amber-like peanut brittle through a process that was probably deeply uncomfortable and possibly dangerous, and allowed himself to be sealed away with appropriate ceremony, attended by his remaining followers, who wept and sang songs about whimsy, while their leader was preserved like the world's strangest museum specimen. With Trembley safely sealed away and out of sight, Northwest was free to complete his transformation of the valley's history, turning himself into the heroic founder and relegating the true origin story to the realm of forgotten truth. The Northwest family built their empire on this foundation of fiction, and they built it efficiently and ruthlessly. Nathaniel Northwest commissioned a grand manor to be built on the highest point in the valley, a location that allowed him to literally look down on the town that grew below. The manor was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure, all stone and wood, an imposing architecture that said clearly that the people who lived here were better than everyone else and wanted you to know it. He established lumber mills to harvest the valley's unusual trees, though he quickly learned that certain groves needed to be left alone unless he wanted his workers to quit en masse after encountering things in those ancient woods that no amount of money could convince them to face again. He attracted more settlers by advertising the valley's resources and its pleasant climate, carefully avoiding any mention of its stranger characteristics unless talking to people who might find such things appealing rather than concerning. As the settlement grew into a proper town, Northwest named it Gravity Falls, a reference to the impressive waterfalls in the area where water seemed to fall with unusual force. The name was more appropriate than Northwest probably realized, as gravity itself did seem to work slightly differently in the valley, one more subtle strangeness among many. The town developed according to Northwest's vision, with proper streets and proper buildings and a proper social hierarchy that placed the Northwest family firmly at its apex. Northwest used his wealth to ensure that this social order remained unchallenged, funding local institutions on the condition that they acknowledged his family's foundational role, commissioning artworks and monuments that reinforced the myth of Nathaniel as the heroic pioneer, and generally making it very clear that questioning the official history would result in social and economic consequences that most people preferred to avoid. But the land remembered the truth, even if most people forgot it or never knew it in the first place. The valley had welcomed Trembley's joyful chaos, had seemed to respond to his innocent wonder with a kind of warm approval. Northwest's calculated exploitation of resources and status-seeking ambition received a less welcoming response from whatever consciousness or force resided in the deep places of the valley. The Northwest Manor, for all its grand architecture and expensive furnishings, was plagued by peculiar occurrences from the very beginning. Doors opened and closed on their own, with no one near them, and no draft to explain the movement. Cold spots appeared in rooms where they had no business being, patches of chill that moved around as if something invisible was walking through the hallways carrying winter with it. Servants reported feeling watched by unseen eyes when they worked in certain parts of the manor, and more than one maid or groundskeeper quit after encountering something they could not or would not describe, but that left them badly shaken. The Northwests attributed these phenomena to drafty construction and overactive imaginations, refusing to admit that perhaps the house itself, or something in it, was expressing disapproval of its occupants. The family's troubles extended beyond mere atmospheric strangeness in their home. Northwest business ventures had a way of encountering unexpected obstacles and complications that their competitors did not face. Equipment would break down at crucial moments, shipments would be delayed by inexplicable circumstances, and workers would quit en masse right when they were most needed, citing reasons that seemed flimsy, but that they insisted on with uncomfortable intensity. One particularly persistent problem involved the lumber mills, where workers regularly reported seeing things in the woods that made them refuse to go into certain areas to cut timber. Northwest dismissed these reports as superstition and laziness, but the fact remained that whole sections of the valley's forest remained unharvested because no amount of money or threat could convince workers to enter those groves, and the few who did enter against advice either did not come back or returned, so changed and frightened that their example kept others away. Still, money has a way of smoothing over troubles, and Northwest had plenty of money. The family maintained their position at the top of Gravity Falls society through the decades, each generation inheriting not just wealth, but the myth of their noble founding role. They controlled the lumber industry, owned much of the valuable land, and used their resources to shape the town according to their preferences. The Northwests became the de facto aristocracy of this small settlement, treating the annual Pioneer Day celebration as their personal stage to celebrate a history that was three-quarters fiction, throwing elaborate parties at their manor that were invitation-only affairs where being excluded was a mark of social failure. The family developed a reputation for coldness and casual cruelty, for treating ordinary townspeople as somehow lesser, for using their wealth as a weapon and their alleged historical importance as a shield against criticism. This created resentment naturally, but it also created a kind of resignation. Generations grew up with the Northwest family at the top of the social structure, and after a while it seemed like just the way things were, as natural and unchangeable as the mountains that surrounded the valley. Most people simply learned to navigate around the Northwests, to avoid conflict with them, to find their satisfaction and happiness in their own circles and communities, rather than trying to challenge a family that had the resources to crush any rebellion. The town developed a quiet culture of resistance, small acts of independence and solidarity that the Northwest could not quite control, but that also never quite threatened their position. It was an uneasy equilibrium, sustainable as long as no one pushed too hard in either direction. Through all of this human drama of false histories and social hierarchies, the valley itself continued its strange, slow life. The peculiar energy that had drawn indigenous peoples and confused early explorers remained unchanged by human presence. Animals continued to behave oddly in certain areas, gathering in circles or following patterns that suggested some kind of purpose beyond simple survival behavior. Plants continued to grow in unusual formations, flowers blooming in colors that should not exist, and mushrooms forming rings of mathematical precision overnight. The ancient trees in the deepest groves continued to grow taller and older, their bark showing patterns that looked almost like writing, and their wood developing properties that defied normal understanding of how wood should behave. The waterfalls continued to fall with their peculiar heavy force, creating spray that made rainbows in impossible conditions and pools that were deeper than they should be. People who stayed in Gravity Falls for extended periods, especially those who lived there through multiple generations, began to notice patterns even if they did not fully understand what they were noticing. Electronics malfunctioned more frequently here than in other places. Not enough to make technology impossible, but enough to be noticeable and annoying. Compasses spun erratically in certain locations, making navigation by traditional means unreliable unless you learned the specific quirks of local magnetic anomalies. Dreams were more vivid here, more likely to be shared between people who should not be dreaming the same things, and occasionally prophetic in ways that were unsettling when you realized that something you dreamed last night was happening right now in waking life. The old symbols that indigenous peoples had carved into trees and stones remained visible despite decades of growth, as if the bark grew around them rather than over them, as if the valley itself was determined to keep these warnings and guides visible for anyone who knew how to read them. Children who grew up in Gravity Falls developed certain characteristics that marked them as different from children who grew up elsewhere. They were more adaptable, more willing to accept strangeness as normal, more likely to see wonder where other children might see only ordinary things. They told stories about encounters with odd creatures in the woods, speaking with absolute certainty about having seen things that adults insisted were just imagination or misidentified normal animals. Sometimes their stories matched up in ways that were hard to dismiss as coincidence. Multiple children from different families describing the same strange things seen in the same location, details aligning in ways that suggested they had seen something real, even if that something should not exist according to any normal understanding of biology or physics. Adults generally chose to treat these stories as childhood imagination, finding it easier to dismiss than to accept the implications of children seeing things that should not be there. The 20th century brought modernity to Gravity Falls in gradual increments, each new technology arriving and being adapted to the town's peculiar circumstances. Electricity came and proved reliable, except in certain locations where lights flickered for no apparent reason, or where power would cut out at specific times with clockwork regularity before returning moments later as if nothing had happened. Telephones arrived and worked well enough except for occasional crosstalk where you could hear fragments of conversations happening on lines that should not be connected to yours, and sometimes the voices you heard did not seem quite human or spoke in languages that no one could identify. Radio came and broadcast normally except on certain frequencies, where instead of normal static, you could sometimes hear music that seemed to come from no known source, or voices that might be echoes of broadcasts from decades ago, or might be something else entirely. Television eventually arrived and brought the outside world into Gravity Falls homes in flickering black and white, and later in color. But even television could not quite dispel the valley's essential strangeness. Shows would occasionally cut out and be replaced briefly by images that should not be part of any broadcast, landscapes that looked alien, or faces that belonged to no human anatomy. These disruptions were brief enough and infrequent, enough that most people attributed them to technical difficulties or atmospheric interference, finding prosaic explanations easier to accept than the alternative, which was that something in the valley itself was occasionally hijacking television signals for purposes unknown and probably unknowable. The town remained stable, but slightly apart from the mainstream of American life, never quite catching up to the times, but never quite falling too far behind either. Young people left for college and careers elsewhere, drawn to cities where cell phone signals were reliable and where the strangeness was at least human in origin. Those who stayed tended to be either families who had been in Gravity Falls for generations and could not imagine living elsewhere, or newcomers who had been drawn to the valley by something they could not quite name. People who felt called to this place by instincts they did not fully understand, but which made them pack up their lives and move to a small Oregon logging town where everyone knew everyone and the forest always seemed to be watching. It was into this long and complicated history, this layer cake of truth and fiction and strangeness both natural and supernatural, that a man named Stanford Pines arrived in the 1970s. Stanford was a scientist and researcher with multiple advanced degrees and a mind that genuinely hungered for the anomalous and unexplained. He had heard rumors about Gravity Falls, whispers in academic circles about this small Oregon town where the laws of nature seemed to be more like guidelines, where strange sightings were common enough that locals barely commented on them, where compasses did not work right, and weird things happened with a frequency that should have attracted more attention, but somehow never quite did. For someone like Stanford, who had spent his entire academic career being told his ideas were too unconventional and his theories too strange, Gravity Falls represented possibility and validation. A place where he might finally find the evidence he needed to prove that reality was far stranger than mainstream science was willing to admit. Stanford arrived in Gravity Falls with minimal fanfare, just another newcomer to a town that had seen many newcomers over the years. He purchased a plot of forested land some distance from the town center, far enough for privacy, but close enough to town that he could get supplies and interact with locals when necessary. He began construction on what would eventually become a large cabin that served as both home and research facility, a structure that grew steadily more complex as Stanford's work expanded. He was a tall man with sharp features and unusually intense eyes, and most noticeably, he possessed 6 fingers on each hand rather than the standard 5. This genetic anomaly had marked him as different from birth, had made him a target for bullies in his youth and a subject of whispered comment throughout his academic career. Gravity Falls, where strangeness was woven into the basic fabric of existence, his extra fingers barely merited a raised eyebrow, and this acceptance must have felt like a kind of homecoming for someone who had never quite fit in anywhere else. From the moment he settled into his cabin and began his research in earnest, Stanford found that the reality of Gravity Falls exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. The valley was not just unusual, but extraordinarily strange. A concentration of paranormal activity that had no parallel in any other documented location. Within his first few weeks of systematic exploration, Stanford encountered creatures that should not exist according to any standard biological classification. He documented gnomes that lived in organized communities and could combine into larger forms, their individual bodies interlocking in ways that suggested either sophisticated cooperation or some kind of hive intelligence. He observed flying eyeballs that he termed eye-bats, creatures that somehow remained airborne despite having no visible means of propulsion, and that seemed to navigate with precision despite having no obvious nervous system. He studied living crystal formations called geodites that generated their own light through means that did not match any known bioluminescence. And these crystals seemed to possess a rudimentary intelligence that allowed them to recognize and respond to human presence in ways that mere minerals should not be capable of doing. He found locations where the laws of physics behaved differently in measurable ways. There were spots in the forest where objects fell at speeds that did not match the expected rate of gravitational acceleration, sometimes falling faster than they should, and sometimes slower, as if gravity itself had different ideas about its own strength in these specific places. He discovered clearings where you could step forward in one direction and emerge from the opposite side of the clearing as if space had looped back on itself, where the distance you walked had no relation to the physical space you traversed. He documented streams that flowed uphill when the moon was full, water defying basic physics to climb slopes at angles that should have been impossible. And when he collected samples of this water and tried to study it in his laboratory, it behaved normally, suggesting that whatever allowed it to flow uphill was a property of the location rather than the water itself. Stanford approached all of this with scientific rigor and systematic methodology. He began keeping detailed journals, bound in leather and marked with his distinctive 6-fingered handprint, documenting every anomaly he encountered. He sketched creatures in careful detail, noting their behaviors and habitats and any patterns he could discern. He took measurements of the locations where physics seemed negotiable, mapping the boundaries of strange zones and looking for commonalities between them. He collected samples of unusual plants and minerals storing them carefully labeled and cataloged in his growing laboratory. His work was meticulous and exhaustive, driven by a genuine passion for understanding rather than mere curiosity or the desire for fame. As his research progressed and his understanding deepened, Stanford began to detect something underlying all of the valley's individual oddities. He noticed that the strangeness was not random, but seemed to radiate from a central point somewhere in the valley, growing weaker as you moved away from this nexus and stronger as you approached it. He started to conceptualize what he called dimensional weakness, places where the barrier between realities grew thin enough that things from other dimensions could bleed through into this one, or where the normal rules of this dimension were influenced by the different rules of adjacent realities. This was not just a collection of random paranormal phenomena, but a coherent effect, a single underlying cause that explained why this particular valley concentrated so much impossibility in one place. Stanford theorized that beneath gravity falls, perhaps deep in the earth, or perhaps in some layer of reality that did not quite occupy physical space the way normal matter did, there was a point where multiple dimensions came close to touching. The barriers that normally kept realities separate were thinner here, worn down by some unknown process, or perhaps deliberately weakened by something that had happened in the deep past. This dimensional weakness created a kind of paranormal hotspot, a place where creatures from other realities could more easily enter this one, where the rules of physics could be influenced by the different physics of neighboring dimensions, where the impossible became merely improbable because the definition of what was possible was broader here than elsewhere. This theory excited Stanford immensely because it meant that everything he was observing could be understood within a coherent framework. It was not magic in the sense of arbitrary supernatural forces that defied explanation, but rather a natural phenomenon that happened to be more complex than standard physics accounted for. If he could map the dimensional weaknesses precisely, if he could understand the mechanics of how barriers between realities functioned and failed, he might be able to do more than just document the paranormal. He might be able to harness it, to control it, to use this knowledge to benefit humanity in ways that would revolutionize science, and perhaps even allow humans to safely explore other dimensions as easily as they explored other continents. But such ambitious research required more than one person could accomplish alone. Stanford needed an assistant, someone with technical skills to help construct the increasingly complex equipment his theories demanded, someone he could trust with discoveries that might make them either celebrated pioneers or laughingstocks, depending on whether the scientific establishment chose to believe them. He reached out to an old college acquaintance named Fiddleford McGucket, a brilliant engineer who had helped Stanford with technical challenges in the past. McGucket possessed a genuine gift for mechanical engineering, an intuitive understanding of how to make machines do things that should not be possible, how to jerry-rig solutions that somehow worked despite violating standard engineering principles. When Stanford wrote to McGucket about the work being done in Gravity Falls, about the potential for discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of reality itself, McGucket responded with enthusiasm. He left behind a comfortable life and secure job to join Stanford in the valley, arriving with a pickup truck full of tools and parts and the kind of optimistic energy that saw every problem as a puzzle waiting to be solved. McGucket was everything Stanford was not in terms of personality. Where Stanford was reserved and intense, McGucket was warm and folksy. Where Stanford was uncomfortable with casual social interaction, McGucket could befriend anyone with ease. But they shared a love of pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and they worked together with the kind of synchronicity that comes when two brilliant minds find themselves pursuing the same goals. Together, Stanford and McGucket constructed increasingly sophisticated equipment in the basement of Stanford's cabin, which had by now grown into a proper research facility, complete with a laboratory, a workshop, and complex security systems. McGucket designed machines that could detect dimensional fluctuations, creating instruments that measured things for which no standard units of measurement existed. They built equipment to map the contours of paranormal hotspots throughout the valley, identifying locations where the dimensional barriers were particularly thin. They constructed devices that could, at least in theory, create new weaknesses in the dimensional fabric, machines that would prove to be far more dangerous than either man fully understood at the time they built them. The work consumed them both, days blurring into nights as they chased one discovery after another. They would pause for quick meals and brief periods of sleep before returning to their research, driven by the intoxicating thrill of uncovering truths that no human had known before. McGucket's engineering genius, combined with Stanford's theoretical knowledge, created a synergy that allowed them to accomplish things neither could have done alone. For a time, it was everything Stanford had dreamed of when he first arrived in Gravity Falls. Pure research, driven by curiosity and friendship. The joy of discovery untainted by concerns about practical applications or commercial value. But their work had attracted attention from a source that Stanford could not have anticipated and would not have known how to prepare for, even if he had anticipated it. There are things that exist in the spaces between dimensions, entities that live in the cracks of reality, and one of these beings had noticed the two humans poking at the walls of the world. This entity had no proper name that human vocal apparatus could pronounce, existing as it did in a state that preceded language and matter, but it would later adopt the designation Bill Cipher, taking a form that humans could at least perceive if not fully comprehend, appearing as a yellow triangle with a single eye, and a penchant for deals and manipulation that would prove catastrophic. Bill existed primarily in what he called the mindscape, the realm of thoughts and dreams, a dimension of pure consciousness where the normal rules of physical reality did not apply. From this vantage point, he could observe the thoughts of sentient beings throughout multiple realities, and he had been watching Stanford's work with growing interest. Bill was trapped in his dimension by laws older than matter, unable to enter the physical world directly, and he saw in Stanford's research a potential doorway, a way to finally break free of the prison that had contained him for eternities beyond human counting. He began to contact Stanford through dreams, appearing at first as what seemed like insights from Stanford's own subconscious, ideas that felt like they came from within, but which were actually being planted from without. The ideas Bill suggested were brilliant and seductive and catastrophically dangerous in ways Stanford would not understand until far too late. Bill planted the concept that Stanford could do more than merely study the dimensional weaknesses, that he could build a machine to create a controlled portal, a doorway that would allow direct and safe access to other dimensions. The scientific and practical implications of such an achievement were staggering. Other dimensions might contain technology millennia ahead of anything on Earth, might hold solutions to problems that had plagued humanity since its beginning. Access to other realities could provide unlimited energy, could revolutionize medicine and physics, could give humanity the keys to the multiverse and transform them from a species confined to one dimension into something capable of exploring the infinite variations of reality itself. Stanford threw himself into this new project with obsessive intensity, designing what he called the Universal Interdimensional Portal. McGucket helped construct it despite growing reservations about the scale and potential danger of what they were building. the portal would require enormous amounts of power, far more than the cabin's generators could provide, necessitating the construction of a dedicated power system that drew electricity from multiple sources and stored it in capacitor arrays that McGucket designed specifically for this purpose. The portal itself would create a controlled rift in reality at the precise point Stanford had identified as the weakest spot in the valley's dimensional barrier, essentially tearing a hole between worlds that could theoretically be opened and closed at will. McGucket built it because he trusted his friend, because he believed in the potential of the work, but also because he began to have misgivings that he tried to voice but could never quite make Stanford hear. There was something about the project that felt wrong to McGucket in ways he could not fully articulate. Some instinct that told him they were tampering with forces they did not fully understand. He had unsettling dreams about the portal, visions of chaos and destruction that might have been warnings or might have been just anxiety manifesting in his sleep. He tried to suggest that perhaps they should proceed more slowly, should test on a smaller scale first. But Stanford was too focused on the goal to hear caution, too consumed by the vision of what they might achieve to properly consider the risks. As construction of the portal progressed toward completion, Stanford began to experience doubts of his own. Bill's presence in his dreams became more overt and less subtle, shifting from helpful inspiration to explicit instruction. The entity revealed itself more fully, and Stanford realized with growing horror that he had been manipulated from the beginning, that Bill's interest in the portal had nothing to do with scientific advancement or benefiting humanity. Bill was trapped in his dimension and wanted out, needed someone in the physical world to build him a door, and had used Stanford's ambition and curiosity to make him into an unwitting tool. When Stanford tried to stop construction immediately, he found that it was too late. The portal was nearly complete. A massive machine buried deep beneath the cabin that hummed with barely contained power, even when inactive, pulsing with energy that felt wrong in ways that made your teeth ache if you spent too long near it. McGucket, who had accidentally glimpsed something terrible through a test activation of the portal, experienced a complete psychological break that would alter the course of his life forever. What he saw in that brief moment when the portal flickered to life and opened for just a second onto somewhere else traumatized him so profoundly that his mind could not process it, could not find a way to integrate this knowledge into his understanding of reality. In desperate self-preservation, he invented a device he called the memory gun, a ray that could selectively erase specific memories from a person's mind. He used it on himself immediately, excising the memory of what he had seen through the portal. But the process damaged something fundamental in his consciousness, and the terror remained even after the specific memory was gone, a nameless dread that haunted him without knowing why. McGucket began using the memory gun compulsively, erasing more and more of his past in an attempt to escape the fear he could not name or understand. Memory by memory, he lost himself, transforming from a brilliant engineer with a sharp mind and warm personality into the rambling, mentally scattered individual that the town would come to know as Old Man McGucket, the local crazy person who lived in the junkyard and spoke in riddles and non-sequiturs, who built bizarre contraptions from scrap and sometimes said things that were prophetic, but mostly said things that made no sense at all. He founded something he called the Society of the Blind Eye, a secret group dedicated to erasing people's memories of supernatural encounters, believing in his damaged mind that ignorance was protection and that people were happier not knowing the truths that had destroyed his own sanity. Stanford realized far too late the full extent of the danger he had created. Bill was not interested merely in entering the physical world to explore or learn. The demon intended to use the portal to break free of his dimensional prison and then to initiate something he called Weirdmageddon, an apocalypse of pure chaos where reality itself would become fluid and nightmarish, where the normal rules that kept existence stable would be dissolved and everything would be transformed according to Bill's mad whims. Stanford documented all of this in his journals with increasingly frantic handwriting, filling pages with warnings and explanations and desperate pleas to anyone who might find these records after he was gone. He described Bill's true nature, detailed the danger the portal represented, and scattered clues about how to stop the demon if he ever did manage to break through. In a decision that showed both wisdom and paranoia, Stanford split his research into 3 separate journals and hid them in different locations throughout Gravity Falls. He reasoned that if the information was scattered, no one could accidentally complete his work and activate the portal without first finding all 3 volumes and understanding the full danger. He marked each journal with a number and his distinctive 6-fingered handprint, wrote warnings on the covers, and hid them where he hoped they would be found only by someone worthy of the knowledge, someone who would understand the responsibility that came with it. Journal 1. He gave to a trusted acquaintance for safekeeping. Journal 2. He hid in a location he felt was secure. Journal 3. He kept with him, continuing to document new discoveries while hoping he would find a way to destroy the portal before disaster could occur. But Bill was not content to wait patiently for Stanford to have a change of heart. The demon attempted to possess Stanford directly, to use the scientist's own body to complete the portal activation and open the door that would free Bill from his dimensional prison. Stanford fought against this possession with every technique he knew, staying awake for days at a time because sleep was when Bill could most easily invade his mind, consuming massive amounts of coffee and using pain to keep himself alert, slowly driving himself to the edge of his own sanity in the process. He knew he could not hold out forever, that eventually exhaustion would claim him, and Bill would slip into his consciousness during a moment of weakness, and he needed help before that happened. Stanford made a desperate decision and called the one person he thought might be able to help, his estranged twin brother Stanley. The two had been close once, decades ago when they were children growing up together with dreams of adventuring side by side. But a fight in their youth had driven them apart, sending their lives down divergent paths. Stanford had pursued academia and research, throwing himself into science with single-minded intensity. Stanley had drifted through various schemes and hustles, becoming a small-time con man who never quite found stable footing in life. They had not spoken in years, decades of resentment and hurt feelings creating a gulf that had seemed unbridgeable. But Stanford had no one else to turn to, no one else he could trust with knowledge this dangerous, and blood mattered even when nothing else did. Stanford sent Stanley a desperate postcard, asking him to come to Gravity Falls immediately, please. No explanation possible in such limited space, but implying emergency and need. Then Stanford waited in his cabin surrounded by protective symbols and talismans, fighting to keep Bill out of his mind, praying that his brother would receive the message and would care enough to respond despite everything. The days of waiting were agonizing, time stretching out as paranoia and exhaustion made reality feel increasingly unstable. Stanford kept Journal 1 close, prepared to give it to Stanley and tell him to take it far away, to hide it somewhere it could never be found and never be used to complete the terrible work that Stanford now desperately wished he had never begun. Stanley Pines received his brother's postcard and stared at it for a long time, emotions warring within him. part of him wanted to ignore it, to let Stanford deal with whatever crisis he had created for himself without Stanley's help. They had not parted on good terms all those years ago, and Stanley had built a life, however rough and unstable, without his brother's presence or assistance. But another part of him, the part that remembered childhood and shared dreams, and the bond between twins that persisted regardless of distance or anger, would not let him simply ignore a call for help. Stanley packed what few belongings mattered to him into his car and drove across the country to reach Gravity Falls, arriving at the cabin in the middle of a cold night, parking his car in the gravel driveway and approaching the door with no clear idea of what awaited him inside. The reunion was not warm or joyful or anything like reconciliation. Stanford, paranoid from days without sleep and fighting constant mental invasion from Bill, greeted Stanley not with welcome, but with accusations and demands. He thrust Journal 1 into Stanley's hands and told him to take it far away, to hide it somewhere it would never be found, to forget about Gravity Falls and Stanford and never come back. Stanley, hurt and confused and angry about being summoned across the entire country only to be immediately rejected again, argued back. The confrontation escalated quickly, voices rising as years of resentment and misunderstanding came pouring out. Both brothers saying things they did not entirely mean, but which reflected real hurts that had never properly healed. They argued in Stanford's basement laboratory, surrounded by the complex equipment and the massive portal that loomed in the center of the space, currently inactive but radiating a sense of barely contained power. Their argument became physical, a wrestling match more than a real fight, both trying to grab the journal or push the other away, moving dangerously close to the portal control panel. In the chaos and confusion of their struggle, Stanley's hand hit a switch he did not know existed, activating the portal that Stanford had been so desperate to keep shut. The machine roared to life with a sound like reality tearing, generating a vortex of impossible energy and colors that no human eye was designed to perceive, a rip in the fabric of existence that pulled at everything nearby with irresistible force. Stanford was standing too close when the portal activated. The vortex grabbed him before either brother could react, before anything could be done to change what was happening. One moment Stanford was there, and the next he was being pulled into the swirling chaos of the portal, his hand reaching out toward Stanley in a gesture that might have been a plea for help, or a goodbye, or just a reflexive attempt to grab something solid. Stanley lunged forward trying to catch his brother's hand, but he was too far away and too slow, and Stanford was sucked into the portal and disappeared. The machine sputtered and died, having consumed most of its stored power in that single catastrophic activation, leaving Stanley alone in a suddenly silent basement, staring at the quiet portal that had just swallowed his brother. In that moment of horror and guilt and desperate determination, Stanley Pines made a decision that would define the next 30 years of his life. He would not leave. He would not report this to authorities who would either not believe him or would take over the facility and destroy any chance of bringing Stanford back. He would not give up and accept that his brother was simply gone. He would learn how to operate Stanford's machine, and he would bring Stanford home, no matter how long it took or what he had to sacrifice to do it. Stanley knew nothing about physics or dimensional theory or any of the science that Stanford had devoted his life to studying. He had barely finished high school, had spent his adult life running cons and schemes that required street smarts rather than academic knowledge. But he was also fiercely loyal to the few people he loved, and despite their differences and years of separation, and the fight that had just led to catastrophe, Stanford was family, and that mattered more than anything else. Stanley began teaching himself from Stanford's notes, reading through the journals and trying to understand concepts that seemed like alien languages at first. He studied the equipment in the basement, figuring out through trial and error what each machine did and how the systems connected to each other. He made mistakes, burned out components that had to be rebuilt or replaced, suffered minor injuries from electrical shocks and mechanical mishaps as he learned through painful experience how to maintain and operate technology he barely understood. But he kept going, driven by guilt over having activated the portal and by hope that somehow, somewhere in another dimension, Stanford was alive and trying to find his own way home. To fund his work and maintain the cabin while conducting this secret mission, Stanley hit upon a scheme that was perfect for someone with his particular background. He opened the cabin to the public as a tourist trap, calling it the Mystery Shack and filling it with obviously fake oddities that he claimed were evidence of the supernatural. He showed tourists deformed taxidermy and claimed they were mythical creatures, pointed to ordinary stains on the floor, and spun elaborate stories about what had caused them, charged admission for exhibits that anyone with sense could see were ridiculous. He adopted his brother's identity, becoming Stanford Pines to the outside world while keeping his true self hidden behind the persona. To everyone in Gravity Falls, he was simply Stanford Pines, the reclusive researcher who had decided to open his home as a tacky tourist attraction for reasons no one entirely understood, but which seemed harmless enough. The Mystery Shack became a local institution, known equally for its cheap thrills and its owner's personality. Stan, as everyone called him, developed a reputation as a gruff showman who ran a gimmick attraction, someone who was amusing in his obvious fakery and reliable even if he was not particularly warm. He hired local teenagers to work summer jobs at the shack, kids who needed pocket money and did not ask too many questions about why the boss sometimes disappeared for hours into his private study or why certain areas of the shack were strictly off-limits. He built a vending machine that served as a hidden entrance to the basement laboratory, a simple but effective way to keep his real work secret from employees and tourists who wandered through the public spaces above. The work progressed with agonizing slowness. Stanley had to learn advanced physics and engineering from scratch, decoding his brother's notes that were written for someone who already understood the fundamentals, figuring out how equipment worked through a process of cautious experimentation that sometimes resulted in small explosions or equipment failures that set him back weeks. He needed to acquire specific parts and components, some of which were exotic enough that obtaining them required careful planning and sometimes outright theft. He needed to gather tremendous amounts of power to reactivate the portal, more than the cabin's normal electrical service could provide, necessitating the construction of additional generators and power storage systems that he built piece by piece over years. Years passed and became a decade, and that decade became 2, then 3. Stanley aged, his dark hair going gray and then white, his body growing softer from stress and the cheap food he lived on, his hands developing calluses and scars from the manual labor of maintaining equipment and building new components. The town came to know him as a fixture of Gravity Falls, as much a part of the landscape as the water tower or the diner. Most people thought of him as just the guy who ran the tourist trap, someone reliable if rough around the edges, someone who had probably always been here and probably always would be. They had no idea about the complex machinery hidden beneath the tacky exhibits, about the desperate mission that consumed every spare moment of his life, about the brother he was trying to save from dimensional exile. Sometimes Stanley wondered if he was chasing an impossible dream, if Stanford might be dead, or if the portal might never work again, no matter how much effort he put into rebuilding it. But he kept going through all the doubts and setbacks, maintaining his cover and working toward the day when he might finally bring his brother home. He collected the other two journals, recovering them from their hiding places through various means, both legal and less so, knowing he would need all three to complete the portal's activation sequence properly. He reinforced the basement laboratory, installed better security systems, and prepared for the day when the portal might open again, and whatever came through it, whether it was Stanford or something else entirely, he would be ready. The Gravity Falls that grew up around Stanley's secret mission was a town that had settled into familiar patterns and rhythms. The Northwest family maintained their position at the top of the social hierarchy, each generation inheriting wealth and the founding myth that justified their status. They continued their tradition of elaborate exclusive parties at the manor, continued to control much of the local economy through ownership and influence, continued to look down on the ordinary townspeople who made up the bulk of Gravity Falls' population. The latest in the Northwest line was a girl named Pacifica, born into wealth and privilege, and raised to believe that her family name made her inherently superior to everyone around her. She was taught to value appearances over substance, to use money as both weapon and shield, to maintain the family reputation, no matter what the cost to herself or others. The town itself remained peculiar in ways that most residents had learned to accept or ignore. Electronics still malfunctioned more often here than elsewhere. Compasses still spun wildly in certain areas. Dreams were still unusually vivid and occasionally prophetic. Strange things were still glimpsed in the deep forest by people who knew better than to talk about them too openly, because talking about the weird stuff marked you as crazy or attention-seeking, and most people preferred to keep their experiences private rather than risk mockery or disbelief. Children still reported seeing impossible things and were still generally not believed by adults who had learned to dismiss such reports as imagination. The town had developed a kind of collective agreement to treat the strangeness as background noise, something you noticed but did not comment on, like having a strange neighbor whose oddities you simply accepted as part of the local landscape. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, as technology advanced and the world became more connected, and Gravity Falls gradually acquired cell phone towers and internet access, the town's essential character remained unchanged. It was still slightly behind the times, still isolated in ways that had nothing to do with geography, still operating according to rhythms that were its own. Young people still left for college and careers elsewhere, and newcomers still occasionally arrived drawn by something they could not quite name. The Mystery Shack still attracted tourists looking for cheap thrills and corny jokes. The Northwest Manor still looked down from its hill over a town that resented the family but had learned to live with them. And beneath one particular tourist trap, a desperate man still worked in secret on a machine that would change everything if he could only make it work. Change arrived in Gravity Falls in early summer, traveling on a bus from California in the form of two 12-year-old twins being sent to spend 3 months with their grunkle Stan. Dipper and Mabel Pines had no idea what awaited them when they stepped off that bus into air that tasted different from home, into light that seemed to fall at subtly wrong angles, into a town that would transform them in ways they could not yet imagine. They expected a boring summer, helping their great-uncle run his tacky tourist trap, maybe sometimes swimming in the lake or hiking in the woods, the kind of summer that would be mildly unpleasant but survivable and ultimately forgettable. What they got was immersion into genuine mystery, real danger, and the discovery that the impossible was not only possible, but depressingly common in this strange corner of Oregon. The twins were opposite in most ways, but united by deep mutual affection. Dipper, whose real name was Mason, but who had acquired his nickname from the birthmark on his forehead that looked like the Big Dipper constellation, was serious and analytical, a boy who loved puzzles and approached the world through careful observation and logical deduction. He wore his trademark pine tree hat everywhere, carried himself with the slight awkwardness of someone who spent more time in his head than in his body, and desperately wanted to be taken seriously by a world that saw him as just a kid. Mabel was chaos and color embodied in a tiny, optimistic package, enthusiastic and emotionally open, someone who approached life as an adventure and other people as friends she simply had not met yet. She wore a different homemade sweater every single day, each one more garish and wonderful than the last, and she had brought her pet pig Waddles, who loved her with the kind of pure devotion that only animals can manage. Stan, meeting the twins for the first time in years, saw them as both opportunity and complication. They would provide free labor for the Mystery Shack during the busy summer season, helping with tours and gift shop duties and all the small tasks that came with running a tourist attraction. But they would also be underfoot, potentially discovering things they should not discover, asking questions he could not answer honestly, without revealing secrets he had kept for 30 years. He set them up in the attic bedroom, gave them minimal instruction on their duties, and hoped that they would spend most of their time entertained by their own activities and not poking around in areas that were none of their business. This hope would prove to be spectacularly misplaced, as Dipper's curiosity and tendency to investigate mysteries was about to collide head-on with a town full of secrets. Within days of arriving in Gravity Falls, Dipper discovered one of Stanford's journals, hidden in the woods near the Mystery Shack. He had been exploring alone, drawn by some instinct toward a specific location, and found the journal concealed inside a strange tree that looked like it had a hollow space deliberately carved into it. The journal was weathered but intact, bound in red leather with a gold hand marking its cover, the hand having 6 fingers rather than 5. Inside were pages filled with detailed notes and diagrams about Gravity Falls paranormal phenomena, warnings about various creatures, sketches of monsters that should not exist, and scattered personal notes suggesting the author had discovered something terrible but had not lived to properly document what it was or how to stop it. Dipper was immediately fascinated by the journal, seeing it as both mystery and guide. Here was proof that someone else had noticed the strangeness of Gravity Falls, someone who had studied it systematically and left a record that could help Dipper understand what he was dealing with. He kept the journal with him constantly, reading through its entries and memorizing its warnings, treating it like a field guide to the supernatural. He did not immediately tell Mabel about the journal, not out of mistrust, but out of a desire to understand it better first, to have some framework for explaining it that would make sense. This decision to keep secrets, even from his sister, would have consequences later. But in the moment, it felt reasonable and necessary. Mabel, meanwhile, had her own encounter with Gravity Falls weirdness that same week, when she met what she thought was a charming boy in the woods, but who turned out to be a stack of gnomes in a trench coat. The gnomes wanted her to be their queen, a position that required marrying their leader and never leaving the forest. And when she politely declined, they became rather insistent, in a way that forced both twins to flee through the woods with hundreds of tiny, bearded men in pursuit. The chase ended with Dipper remembering a journal entry about gnomes being vulnerable to loud noises, and the twins escaping in Stan's golf cart, while deploying a leaf blower against their pursuers with devastating effectiveness. The experience was strange and frightening, but also oddly humorous, and it established a pattern that would define their summer. Encounter weird thing, consult journal if applicable, figure out solution through quick thinking and teamwork, survive to tell the tale. The summer became a series of escalating encounters with Gravity Falls paranormal residents and phenomena. The twins met Seuss, the eternally cheerful handyman who worked at the Mystery Shack and treated every day as an adventure and every problem as a puzzle to be solved with enthusiasm rather than worry. They met Wendy Corduroy, the laid-back teenage cashier who worked summer shifts at the shack, and who Dipper immediately developed an awkward crush on despite the age difference making any real relationship impossible. They befriended various townspeople, from lazy Susan at the diner to the enthusiastic tourists who visited the Mystery Shack seeking cheap thrills and finding more than they bargained for when the twins were involved. They encountered creatures from the journal, each one teaching them something new about how to survive in Gravity Falls. Wax figures that came to life at night and trapped them in the abandoned wax museum section of the Mystery Shack, defeated when Dipper figured out that they were vulnerable to hot water that would melt them back into harmless wax. A lake monster called the Gobblewonker that turned out to be a mechanical creation built by Old Man McGucket, one of his many bizarre inventions crafted from junk and genius in equal measure. Time travel shenanigans involving a tape measure that could reverse time by exactly 10 seconds, useful for avoiding embarrassment, but dangerous when overused. Mabel developing a crush on a series of boys who turned out to be variously unsuitable in ways ranging from mundane to supernatural, and Dipper trying to navigate his feelings for Wendy while gradually realizing that age differences matter and that admiration is not the same as romantic love. But beyond individual adventures, the twins began to change Gravity Falls itself through their presence and actions. Mabel's aggressive friendliness broke down social barriers that had stood for years. Her refusal to accept that people had to be defined by labels or limited by past mistakes, creating space for growth and change. She befriended people who had been isolated or outcast, saw potential in those the town had written off, and generally spread an infectious optimism that made others believe things could be better than they were. Dipper's obsession with solving mysteries led him to uncover truths that had been buried or forgotten, shaking up the town's comfortable acceptance of its own mythology and official histories. Together they represented something new in Gravity Falls, a force for connection and revelation in a place that had grown comfortable with its divisions and hidden truths. Their nemesis emerged early in the summer in the form of Lil Gideon Gleeful, the child psychic who ran the tent of telepathy with his family. Gideon was a performer like Stan, but with actual supernatural power backing up his act, possessing a mystical amulet that granted him telekinetic abilities. Behind his cherubic appearance and affected southern charm, Gideon was ruthless and entitled, someone who believed that his psychic powers and his family's wealth made him special and deserving of whatever he wanted. He became obsessed with both taking over the Mystery Shack to expand his own tourist operation and with possessing Mabel, whom he decided should be his queen through logic that made sense only to him and which completely ignored Mabel's own feelings on the subject. The conflict between Gideon and the Pines family escalated throughout the early summer, each confrontation raising the stakes and increasing the personal animosity. Gideon used his amulet to terrorize the town and manipulate events in his favor, wielding power that a child should not have and using it with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been told no in any meaningful way. Stan opposed him both because Gideon threatened the Mystery Shack and because Stan had developed genuine affection for his niece and nephew and would not tolerate someone threatening them. The conflict reached a climax when Gideon deployed a giant robot in an attempt to destroy the Mystery Shack completely. A robot that Dipper and Mabel defeated through a combination of cleverness and the discovery that Gideon's power came from his amulet rather than from any innate ability. With Gideon defeated and arrested for his crimes, with the amulet destroyed and his illusions shattered, the Pines family could have settled into a more normal routine for the remainder of the summer. But Gravity Falls was not done revealing its secrets, and Dipper's investigation into the journal's author led him deeper into mysteries that had been buried for decades. He discovered through careful analysis of clues and exploration of locations mentioned in cryptic journal entries that the author had built a hidden bunker somewhere in the woods, a secure facility where dangerous research had been conducted and dangerous things had been stored. Finding this bunker became an obsession for Dipper, who saw it as the key to understanding not just the journal, but the entire truth of what Gravity Falls really was. When they finally located the bunker, hidden beneath a tree in a remote part of the forest, they found an abandoned facility full of equipment and notes that provided tantalizing glimpses of the author's work and paranoid warnings about experiments gone wrong. But they also found that the bunker was not quite as abandoned as it appeared. A shapeshifter that the author had captured and studied was still imprisoned there, trapped in a cryogenic chamber, but very much alive and very angry about decades of confinement. The encounter with the shapeshifter was one of the most genuinely frightening experiences of the twin summer. Facing a creature that could perfectly mimic any of them and turn their own appearances and voices into weapons of confusion and terror. They escaped the bunker with help from Wendy and Seuss, who had accompanied them on the expedition, and with new information about the author that made them more real in Dipper's mind. The six-fingered hand symbol that marked all the journals belonged to a real person who had been here in Gravity Falls, who had documented and studied the same phenomena that the twins were now encountering. Dipper began to idolize this mysterious figure, seeing in those written observations and careful scientific approach a kindred spirit who understood that the proper response to mystery was not fear or denial, but systematic investigation and documentation. He wondered what had happened to the author, whether they might still be alive somewhere, whether he might someday meet them and learn directly from someone who had clearly mastered the art of surviving Gravity Falls dangers. Mabel, less interested in the dry academic aspects of solving mysteries, nonetheless participated in all their adventures with enthusiasm and an emotional intelligence that complemented Dipper's analytical approach. Where Dipper saw puzzles to be solved, Mabel saw people to be helped and connections to be made. Her instinct was always toward empathy and inclusion, toward seeing the humanity in others even when they made it difficult, toward building bridges rather than burning them. This difference in approach sometimes caused tension between the twins, but more often it created a balance that made them more effective together than either would have been alone. They discovered the Society of the Blind Eye, a secret cult that had been erasing people's memories of supernatural encounters for decades. And in confronting this group, they learned the terrible truth about Old Man McGucket. The rambling, crazy person they had dismissed as local color was actually Fiddleford McGucket, the brilliant engineer who had worked with the journal's author and who had destroyed his own mind trying to escape memories too terrible to bear. Seeing what McGucket had become, understanding the price that obsessive pursuit of truth could exact, gave Dipper pause and made him reconsider his own tendency toward putting mysteries ahead of relationships. They chose to disband the Society of the Blind Eye, to stop the memory erasure that had kept the town ignorant, and to restore what memories they could to McGucket, even though those restored memories brought pain along with understanding. As summer progressed toward its inevitable end, both twins struggled with the knowledge that this strange, wonderful, terrible time was temporary. Dipper grappled with his feelings for Wendy, eventually confessing them to her in the bunker, and receiving a gentle rejection that acknowledged his feelings, but clarified that the age gap between them made any romantic relationship impossible. The rejection hurt, but it also brought a kind of peace, transforming his feelings from painful longing into genuine friendship that would prove more valuable and more lasting than romance would have been. Mabel faced her own crisis when she realized that returning home meant leaving behind the friendships she had built and the person she had become in Gravity Falls, returning to a normal life where nobody understood how much she had grown and changed. Through all these personal dramas and supernatural encounters, Stan continued his secret work in the basement, coming ever closer to reactivating the portal that he had spent 30 years learning to operate. The portal's energy signature grew stronger as he brought it toward full operational capacity, and this growing power began to attract unwanted attention from government agencies that monitored paranormal activity. Agents Powers and Trigger, who had investigated Gravity Falls once before when the twins accidentally summoned zombies, returned with more resources and more determination to uncover whatever was creating the anomalous readings they were detecting. Stan found himself racing against time, trying to complete the portal's activation before the agents could discover his secret and shut down the facility. Everything came to a head in a single chaotic convergence of events. The twins, following clues from the journal and their own growing suspicions about Stan's behavior, discovered the hidden laboratory beneath the Mystery Shack. Government agents literally battered down the door, determined to stop whatever dangerous experiment was generating the readings they had been tracking. Stan made his final adjustments to the portal, bringing it to full power despite not knowing exactly what would happen when it activated. The twins confronted Stan about his lies and deceptions, hurt that he had been keeping such massive secrets from them all summer, confused about what was really happening and whether they could trust the great uncle they had come to love. Stan made a simple plea: "Trust me." Despite everything, despite the lies and the secrets and the fear of what might happen, Dipper and Mabel chose to believe in the man who had protected them all summer, who had shown them care in his own gruff way, who had become family in the truest sense. They helped Stan complete the portal's activation sequence, holding off the agents and trusting that Stan knew what he was doing, even when they could not see the full picture. Reality tore open in a blast of energy that sent shockwaves through the dimensional barrier, the portal becoming a window onto impossible colors and geometries that hurt to look at directly. And from this chaos, a figure was ejected onto the laboratory floor. Stanford Pines emerged from 30 years of interdimensional exile, pulled back from places beyond normal reality to stand once again in his own laboratory. He was older, grayer, marked by his experiences, but fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered. The reunion between the brothers was immediate and emotional, decades of separation evaporating in an embrace that said everything that words could not convey. Stanford had survived through intelligence and stubbornness, had traveled through dimension after dimension, learning secrets about the multiverse that no other human had ever known, had aged during his exile, but not in proportion to the time that had passed on Earth due to traveling through spaces where time itself was negotiable. He had never stopped trying to find his way home, and Stanley had never stopped trying to bring him back. And now, against all odds, they were both here together again. The twins were initially thrilled to meet Stanford, the author of the journals having been Dipper's idol all summer. But complications arose quickly that would test the family bonds they had been building. Stanford was more paranoid and less emotionally accessible than the twins expected. Years of surviving hostile dimensions having taught him to trust slowly and guard his secrets carefully. He immediately took charge of the situation, explaining rapidly about Bill's cipher and the threat the demon posed, about the rift in reality that the portal's activation had created, about the need to keep this rift contained before Bill could exploit it. He saw the twins as potential liabilities, children who did not understand the dangers they were dealing with, and his instinct was to send them away for their own safety, rather than including them in the work that needed to be done. Stanford also harbored resentment toward Stanley for having activated the portal in the first place all those years ago, not yet ready to acknowledge that Stanley's initial mistake had led to 30 years of loyalty and eventually to Stanford's rescue. The brothers had unresolved issues from before Stanford's disappearance, old hurts and resentments that interdimensional separation had preserved rather than erased, and these began to surface in arguments and passive-aggressive comments that confused and worried the twins who had expected the reunion to be purely joyful. The family dynamics became complicated and sometimes painful, everyone wanting to trust and connect, but carrying baggage that made connection difficult. Everyone meaning well, but communicating badly, creating friction where there should have been harmony. The dimensional rift that Stanford warned about became Bill's opportunity to finally achieve the freedom and power he had sought for so long. The demon had been manipulating events throughout the summer, appearing to various residents in dreams and making small deals that gave him leverage and influence in the physical world. He knew that Stanford's return had created a rift, a crack in the dimensional barrier that was being kept stable through careful management, but which could be exploited if Bill could get his manipulative fingers on it. He needed someone to shatter the rift for him, someone who would do so thinking they were doing something good. And he found his Patsy in Mabel at her most vulnerable moment. As summer approached its end, and the reality of returning home loomed large, Mabel faced the painful truth that everything she loved about Gravity Falls would be left behind when she climbed onto that bus back to California. Her friendships would become long distance at best. The adventures would end. The person she had become here would be forced back into the smaller life waiting for her at home. In this moment of fear and sadness, Bill appeared to her and offered a beautiful lie, a bubble of reality where summer never ended and nothing ever changed, where she could have everything she wanted forever. Mabel, tired of being strong and facing hard truths, accepted the offer, not understanding that Bill's gift was really a prison, and that using her to steal the rift would doom everyone she cared about. Bill shattered the dimensional rift and began Weirdmageddon, transforming Gravity Falls into a nightmare realm where physics were suggestions and horror became manifest. The sky split into impossible colors and geometries that hurt human eyes to perceive. Pyramids of flesh and madness rose from the earth, defying gravity and architecture in equal measure. Creatures from nightmares and fever dreams wandered the streets, things with too many limbs or no limbs at all. Beings of pure chaos given temporary form by Bill's will. People were transformed into statues and furniture and living toys for Bill's amusement, their consciousness preserved so they could experience their transformation, but unable to do anything about it. The town was cut off from the outside world by a barrier of pure chaos, a wall that prevented anyone from entering or leaving, and which turned back anyone who tried to breach it, with displays of surreal horror that destroyed their sanity if they looked too long. Bill established himself as a mad god ruling over this nightmare realm from his throne at the pyramid. A pyramid of impossible angles and nightmare geometry that floated above the town. He transformed reality according to his whims, giving himself a physical form more substantial than the triangle he usually appeared as, surrounding himself with creatures from other dimensions who served as his army and his court. He celebrated his freedom with parties that would have been fun if they were not so terrifying, if the revelry did not involve torture and transformation, and games played with sentient beings as pieces. He began making plans to expand his domain beyond Gravity Falls, to spread Weirdmageddon across the entire planet, and eventually throughout the dimension, turning all of reality into his personal playground where nothing was permanent and everything was subject to his random, cruel whims. The Pines family fought back against this apocalypse with every resource and skill they possessed. Dipper, Wendy, and Suze survived the initial chaos by quick thinking and remembered lessons from all their summer adventures, knowing how to recognize danger and how to keep moving when staying still meant transformation or death. They navigated through a landscape of broken reality, facing creatures that defied description and challenges that tested their courage and friendship in equal measure. Their goal was to reach Mabel and free her from the bubble prison Bill had created, the beautiful lie that kept her passive and docile while the world burned around her. Finding Mabel meant entering the bubble and confronting the false paradise Bill had constructed from her own desires and fears. Inside the bubble, summer never ended, and all her friends were present, and everything was perfect in ways that real life never quite managed to be. But it was also hollow and fake. And deep down, Mabel knew this, even as she tried to convince herself otherwise. Dipper reached her through patience and honesty, not trying to force her to leave, but helping her see that hiding from pain meant hiding from growth, that real life with its endings and changes and disappointments was better than a beautiful lie because at least it was true. Mabel chose reality, chose to grow up and face what came next even though it hurt, grabbed her brother's hand, and left the bubble as it dissolved around them. Reunited, the siblings found that Stanford and Stanley had been gathering forces for a final stand against Bill. The residents of Gravity Falls who had escaped Bill's initial purge had banded together, creating a refugee camp and planning resistance. Pacifica Northwest, who had transformed throughout the summer from spoiled rich girl into someone with genuine courage and compassion, joined the fight. McGucket contributed his genius and his junkyard full of strange inventions. Wendy and Sue stood ready to face impossible odds, because that's what you did for family. Others from the town who had been touched by the twins' adventures throughout the summer came forward, ready to fight for their home, even when victory seemed impossible. Stanford revealed that he had a plan to defeat Bill permanently, a zodiac-based ritual that required 10 specific people to join hands in a specific pattern while focusing their will on banishing the demon. The ritual demanded unity and cooperation, old enemies setting aside feuds and hurt feelings to work toward a common goal. But it also required that Stanford and Stanley resolve their own conflicts, that they forgive each other for old hurts and recent misunderstandings, that they act as brothers rather than as rivals, carrying decades of resentment. When the moment came to perform the ritual, when everyone was in position and ready, the brothers began to argue instead of focusing, falling back into old patterns of blame and accusation at the worst possible moment. Bill, watching from his throne of madness, exploited their division with glee. He captured the entire family in a nightmare prison of living tissues that held them immobile while he mocked their failure and prepared to extend his chaos beyond Gravity Falls. The situation seemed hopeless, the family trapped and Bill triumphant, and reality itself bending further toward permanent chaos with each passing moment. But Stanley had one more trick, one final con that drew on his lifetime of being underestimated and overlooked. He convinced Bill that he was actually Stanford, swapping places with his twin brother through misdirection and their natural resemblance, letting the demon enter his mind seeking the equation that would break the barrier, keeping Bill confined to Gravity Falls. Once Bill was inside Stanley's mind, Ford activated McGucket's memory gun at full power, erasing Stanley's memories entirely and destroying Bill in the process. The demon's last scream echoed across dimensions as he was erased from existence, his physical form shattering into flames and his consciousness destroyed along with the memories he had been trying to steal. Reality began to reassert itself slowly, the nightmare realm fading like a bad dream, transformed victims returning to their normal forms, the barrier around Gravity Falls dissolving as the force maintaining it ceased to exist. But Stanley stood blank and confused, not knowing his own name or recognizing the people around him who wept for his sacrifice, having given up his entire identity to save everyone he loved. The family refused to accept this ending as permanent. Using photographs and stories, videos and objects that held memories, they began rebuilding Stanley's identity piece by piece. Stanford led the effort, telling his brother about their childhood together, about shared dreams and mutual failures and the long years of separation. Dipper and Mabel added their own memories from the summer, recounting adventures and reminding Stanley of the person he had been to them, the gruff protector who had shown them love in his own awkward way. Slowly, like dawn breaking over mountains, Stanley's memories returned, not in a rush but gradually, fragments linking together until the whole picture emerged and he could speak his own name again and recognize his family and understand what he had done for them. Summer ended as it had to, the calendar turning and responsibilities calling the twins back to California. Pacifica gave Mabel a friendship bracelet, a gesture that would have been unthinkable at the summer's beginning, but which felt right now. Wendy wrote Dipper a letter acknowledging their friendship and promising to stay in touch. A better gift than romance would have been, because it was honest and real. Seuss was promoted to running the Mystery Shack, while Stan and Ford pursued their own plans. The brothers, having finally reconciled after decades of hurt and misunderstanding, decided to spend their remaining years adventuring together, sailing around the world to see its wonders before age made such journeys impossible. The bus carried Dipper and Mabel away from Gravity Falls toward futures that had been shaped by their summer in the strange town. They were not the same children who had arrived uncertain and bored 3 months earlier. They had faced impossible dangers and prevailed, learned lessons that no classroom could teach, discovered capacities within themselves that surprise and necessity had revealed. They had saved the world and maintained their bond as siblings and grown up in ways that mattered. The town shrank behind them as the bus pulled away, but it would never truly leave them, remaining in memory and dream as the place where they had learned who they could be when everything was at stake. Gravity Falls returned to its peculiar normalcy in the wake of Weirdmageddon, the townspeople retaining only fractured memories of the apocalypse, dreams that might have been real or might have been mass hallucination induced by something in the water. The official explanation involved gas leaks and collective hysteria, a story that satisfied those who needed rational explanations while allowing those who knew better to keep their truths private. The forest remained full of mysteries. Creatures still dwelt in secret places, and the dimensional weakness at the valley's heart continued to make reality negotiable for those who knew how to look. The Northwest Manor stood on its hill, the family's grip on power loosened by Pacifica's defection, but not broken entirely. The Mystery Shack continued drawing tourists seeking cheap thrills, never knowing that real wonders lived in the basement laboratories below the tacky exhibits. Life continued its dance between mundane and magical. Children going to school and occasionally seeing things they couldn't explain. Adults working jobs while navigating a landscape where compasses didn't quite work right. The journals remained, hidden but findable, waiting for the next curious mind to discover them. Years would pass, the twins would grow and return for visits, and the strange little town would keep its secrets while welcoming those worthy of knowing them. The valley dreams beneath its blanket of trees, remembering everything, forgetting nothing, existing as it always has, as a thin place where wonder lives alongside danger, and the impossible becomes merely improbable. The story of Gravity Falls continues whether we watch it or not, moving at its own pace, holding its secrets with patient grace. All is well, all is resolved, and you can rest now knowing that sometimes the strange prevails and family matters and wonder exists in the world waiting to be found. Let the images fade, let the names become distant, let the whole intricate timeline blur into a peaceful sense of having been somewhere special, somewhere that will always exist in memory as a place where anything was possible and everything turned out all right in the end.